Chapter 2, Part 2. Just to the stern, Assistant Second Engineer Haxeth, now on the dry side of the watertight door, struggled to get boiler room number 5 back to normal. The sea still spouted through a 2-foot gash near the closed door, but Assistant Engineers Harvey and Wilson had a pump going, and it was keeping ahead of the water. For a few moments the stokers stood by, aimlessly watching the engineers rig the pumps. Then the engine room phoned to send them to the boat deck. They trooped up the escape ladder, but the bridge ordered them down again, and for a while they milled about the working alleyway on E deck, halfway up, halfway down, caught in the bureaucracy of a huge ship and wondering what to do next. Meanwhile, the lights went out in boiler room number 5. Engineer Harvey ordered Fireman Barrett, who had stayed behind, to go aft to the engine room for lanterns. The connecting doors were all shut, so Barrett had to climb to the top of the escape ladder, cross over, and go down the other side. By the time he retraced his steps, the engineers had the lights on again, and the lanterns weren't needed. Next, Harvey told Barrett to shut down the boilers. The pressure, built up while the ship was at full stern, now lifted the safety valves and was blowing joints. Barrett scrambled back up the ladder and drafted 15 or 20 of the stokers wandering around E deck. They all clattered down and began wetting the fires. It was back-breaking work, boxing up the boilers and putting on dampers to stop the steam from rising. Fireman Camish still remembers it with feeling. We certainly had one hell of a time putting those fires out. Clouds of steam gushed through the boiler room as the men sweated away. But gradually order returned. The lights burned bright, the place was clear of water, and in number 5, at any rate, everything seemed under control. There was an air of cheerful confidence by the time word spread that the men on the 12 to 4 watch were dragging their beds to the recreation deck because their rooms were flooded. The men on the 8 to 12 watch paused in their work, thought it was a huge joke, and had a good laugh. Up on the bridge, Captain Smith tried to piece the picture together. No one was better equipped to do it. After 38 years' service with White Star, he was more than just senior captain of the line. He was a bearded patriarch, worshipped by crew and passengers alike. They loved everything about him, especially his wonderful combination of firmness and urbanity. Urbanity. It was strikingly evident in the master of cigars. Cigars, says his daughter, were his pleasure, and one was allowed to be in the room only if one was absolutely still, so that the blue cloud over his head never moved. Captain Smith was a natural leader, and on reaching the wheelhouse after the crash, he paused only long enough to visit the starboard wing of the bridge to see if the iceberg was still in sight. First Officer Murdoch and Fourth Officer Boxhall trailed along, and for a moment the 3 officers merely stood peering into the darkness. Boxhall thought he saw a dark shape far astern, but he wasn't sure. From then on, all was business. Captain Smith sent Boxhall on a fast inspection of the ship. In a few minutes he was back. He had been as far forward in the steerage as he could go, and there was no sign of damage. This was the last good news Captain Smith heard that night. Still worried, Smith now told Boxhall, go down and find the carpenter and get him to sound the ship. Boxhall wasn't even down the bridge ladder when he bumped into Carpenter J. Hutchinson rushing up. As Hutchinson elbowed his way by, he gasped, "She's making water fast." Hard on the carpenter's heels came mail clerk Iago Smith. He, too, pushed on toward the bridge, blurting as he passed, "The mail hold is filling rapidly." Next to arrive was Bruce Ismay. He had pulled a suit over his pajamas, put on carpet slippers, and climbed to the bridge to find whether anything was happening that the president of the line should know. Captain Smith broke the news about the iceberg. Ismay then asked, "Do you think the ship is seriously damaged?" A pause, and the captain slowly answered, I'm afraid she is. They would know soon enough. A call had been sent for Thomas Andrews, managing director of Harland and Wolff Shipyard. As the Titanic's builder, Andrews was making the final maiden voyage to iron out any kinks in the ship. Final maiden voyage? No. Was making the maiden voyage to iron out any kinks in the ship. If anyone could figure out the situation, here was the man. He was indeed a remarkable figure. As builder, he of course knew every detail about the Titanic, but there was so much more to him than that. Nothing was too great or too small for his attention. He even seemed able to anticipate how the ship would react in any situation. He understood ships the way some men are supposed to understand horses. And he understood equally well the people who run ships. They all come to Andrews with their problems. One night, it might be First Officer Murdoch, worried because he had been suspended by Chief Officer Wilde. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Let me read that one over. He understood equally well the people who run ships. They all came to Andrews with their problems. One night, it might be First Officer Murdoch, worried because he had been superseded by Chief Officer Wilde. The next night, it might be a couple of quarreling stewardesses who looked to Andrews as a sort of Supreme Court. This very evening, Chief Baker Charles Jogan made him a special loaf of bread. So far, Andrews' trip had been what might be expected. All day long he roamed the ship, taking volumes of notes. At 6:45 every evening he dressed for dinner, dining usually with old Dr. O'Laughlin, the ship's surgeon, who also had a way with the stewardesses. And then back to his stateroom, A36, piled high with plans and charts and blueprints. There he would assemble his notes and work out his recommendations. Tonight the problems were typical. Trouble with the restaurant galley hot press. The coloring of the pebble dashing on the private promenade decks was too dark. Too many screws in all the stateroom hat hooks. There was also the plan to change part of the writing room into 2 more staterooms. The writing room had originally been planned partly as a place where the ladies could retire after dinner. But this was the 20th century, and the ladies just wouldn't retire. Clearly, a smaller room would do. Completely absorbed, Andrews scarcely noticed the jar, and stirred from his blueprints only when he got Captain Smith's message that he was needed on the bridge. In a few minutes, Andrews and the captain were making their own tour, down the crew's stairway to attract less attention, along the labyrinth of corridors far below, by the water surging into the mailroom, past the squash court, where a sea now lapped against the foul line in the backboard. Threading their way back to the bridge, they passed through the A-deck foyer, still thronged with passengers standing around. Everybody studied the 2 men's faces for some sign of good news or bad. Nobody could detect any clue. Some of the crew weren't so guarded. In D60, when Mrs. Henry Sleeper Harper asked Dr. O'Laughlin to persuade her sick husband to stay in bed, the old doctor exclaimed, "They tell me the trunks are floating around in the hold. You may as well go on deck." In C-51, a young governess named Elizabeth Schutz sat with her charge, 19-year-old Margaret Graham. Seeing an officer pass the cabin door, Miss Schutz asked him if there was any danger. He cheerfully said no, but then she overheard him further down the hall say, "We can keep the water out for a while." Miss Schutz glanced at Margaret, who was uneasily nibbling at a chicken sandwich. Her hand shook so badly the chicken kept falling out of the bread. No one was asking questions along the working alleyway on E-deck. This broad corridor was the quickest way from one end of the ship to the other. The officers called it Park Lane, the crew Scotland Road. Now it was crowded with pushing, shoving people. Some were stokers forced out of boiler room number 6, but most were steerage passengers, slowly working their way aft, carrying boxes, bags, and even trunks. These people didn't need to be told there was trouble. To those berthed far below on the starboard side, the crash was no faint grinding jar. It was a tremendous noise that sent them tumbling out of bed. Miss Selene Yazbek, a bride of 50 days, ran out into the corridor with her husband. Instead of making the long hike to the deck, it was easier to look far below for trouble. In their night clothes, they walked along to a door leading down to the boiler rooms and peeked through. Engineers were struggling to make repairs and get the pumps going. The Yazbeks needed no second glance. They rushed back to their cabin to dress. Far above on A deck, second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley noticed a curious thing. As he started below to check his cabin, he felt certain the stairs weren't quite right. They seemed level, yet his feet didn't fall where they should. Somehow they stayed forward off balance, as though the steps were tilted down toward the bow. Major Puchin noticed it too. As he stood with Mr. Hayes at the forward end of A deck, looking down at the steerage passengers playing soccer with the loose ice, he sensed a very slight tilt in the deck. "Why, she is listing!" he cried to Hayes. "She should not do that. The water is perfectly calm and the boat has stopped." "Oh, I don't know," Mr. Hayes replied placidly. "You cannot sink this boat." Others also felt the downward slant, but it seemed tactless to mention the matter. In boiler room number 5, Fireman Barrett decided to say nothing to the engineers working on the pumps. Far above in the A-deck foyer, Colonel Gracie and Clinch Smith had the same reaction. On the bridge, the commander showed the Titanic slightly down at the head and listing 5 degrees to starboard. Nearby, Andrews and Captain Smith did some fast figuring. Water in the forepeak, number 1 hold, number 2 hold, mailroom, boiler number 6, boiler room number 5, water 14 feet above keel level in the first 10 minutes, everywhere except boiler room number 5. Put together, the facts showed a 300-foot gash, with the first 5 compartments hopelessly flooded. What did this mean? Andrews quietly explained. The Titanic could float with any of her 16 watertight compartments flooded. She could float with any 3 of her first 5 compartments flooded. She could even float with all of her first 4 compartments gone. But no matter how they sliced it, she could not float with all of her first 5 compartments full. The bulkhead between the 5th and 6th compartments was only as high as E deck. If the first 5 compartments were flooded, the boat would sink so low that the water in the 5th compartment must overflow into the 6th. When that was full, it would overflow into the 7th, and so on. It was a mathematical certainty, pure and simple. There was no way out. But it still was a shock. After all, the Titanic was considered unsinkable. And not just in the travel brochures. The highly technical magazine Shipbuilder described her compartment system in a special edition in 1911, pointing out, "The captain may, by simply moving an electric switch, instantly close the doors throughout and make the vessel practically unsinkable." Now all the switches were pulled, and Andrews said it made no difference. It was hard to face, and especially hard for Captain Smith. Over 59 years old, he was retiring after this trip. Might even have done it sooner, but he traditionally took the White Star ships on their maiden voyages. Only 6 years before, when he brought over the brand new Adriatic, he remarked, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any virtual disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." Now he stood on the bridge of a liner twice as big, twice as safe, and the builder told him it couldn't float. At 12:05 a.m., 25 minutes after that bumping, grinding jar, Captain Smith ordered Chief Officer Wild to uncover the boats, First Officer Murdoch to muster the passengers, Sixth Officer Moody to get out the list of boat assignments, Fourth Officer Boxhall to wake up Second Officer Lightoller, and Third Officer Pittman. The captain himself then walked about 20 yards to the port side of the boat deck to the wireless shack. Inside, First Operator John George Phillips and Second Operator Harold Bride showed no sign that they realized what was happening. It had been a tough day. In 1912, wireless was still an erratic novelty. Range was short, operators were inexperienced, and signals were hard to catch. There was a lot of relaying, a lot of repeats, and a lot of frivolous private traffic. Passengers were fascinated by the new miracle and couldn't resist the temptation of sending messages to friends back home or on other ships. All this Sunday, the messages had piled up. It was enough to fray the nerves of any man working a 14-hour day at $30 a month, and Phillips was no exception. Evening came, and still the bottomless in-basket, still the petty interferences. Only an hour ago, just when he was at last in good contact with Cape Race, the Californian barged in with some message about icebergs. She was so close she almost blew his ears off. No wonder he snapped back. Shut up, shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race. It was such a hard day at that second operator Bride decided to relieve Phillips at midnight, even though he wasn't due until 2 a.m. He woke up at about 11:55, brushed by the green curtain separated the sleeping quarters from the office, and asked Phillips how he was getting along. Phillips said he just finished the Cape Race traffic. Bride padded back to his berth and took off his pajamas. Phillips called after him that he thought the ship had been damaged somehow and they'd have to go back to Belfast. In a couple of minutes, Bride was dressed and took over the headphones. Phillips was already behind the green curtain when Captain Smith appeared. We've struck an iceberg, and I'm having an inspection made to see what it has done to us. You better get ready to send out a call for assistance. But don't send it until I tell you. Then he left, but returned again in a few minutes. This time he merely stuck his head in the doorway. Send the call for assistance. By now, Phillips was back in the room. He asked the captain whether to use the regulation distress call. Smith replied yes at once. He handed Phillips a slip of paper with the Titanic's position. Phillips took the headphones from Bride, and at 12:15 a.m. began tapping out the letters CQD. At that time, the usual international call of distress, followed by MGY, the call letters of the Titanic. Again and again, 6 times over, the signal rasped out into the cold blue Atlantic night. 10 miles away, Third Officer Groves of the Californian sat on the bunk of the wireless operator Cyril F. Evans. Groves was young, alert, and always interested in what was going on in the world. After work, he liked to drop by Evans' wireless shack and pick up the latest news. Even liked to fool with the set. This was all right with Evans. There weren't many officers on third-rate liners interested in the outside world, much less the wireless telegraphy. In fact, there weren't any others on the Californian, so he used to welcome Groves' visits. But not tonight. It had been a hard day, and there was no other operator to relieve him. Besides, he had been pretty roughly handled toward 11 o'clock when he tried to break in on the Titanic and tell her about the ice blocking the Californian. So he lost no time tonight, closing down his set at 11:30, his scheduled hour for going off duty. Now, dead tired, he was in no mood for shooting the breeze with anybody. Groves made a brave try. What ships have you got, Sparks? Only the Titanic. Evans scarcely bothered to glance up from his magazine. This was no news to Groves. He recalled that when he showed Captain Lord the strange liner had just stopped nearby, the captain told him that would be the Titanic on her maiden voyage. In search of something more interesting, Groves took the headphones and put them on. He was really getting quite good, if the message was simple enough, but he didn't know too much about the equipment. The Californian set had a magnetic detector that ran by clockwork. Groves didn't wind it up, so he heard nothing. Giving up, he put the phones back on the table and went below to find livelier company. It was just a little after 12:15 a.m.